So good morning, folks, and welcome to our Business Strategy Masterclass. My name is Chris McNulty. I'm joined here by my colleague, Matt Shaffer. We're going to be underway here in just a minute, but let's talk a little bit about what we're covering today. So today, we're going to spend time walking through business strategy, why it's needed, why it's hard, and how you can approach that with the company operating system. So we'll spend some time going through a round of introductions, explain why this matters, what is the company operating system, and even more importantly, how can you get started with one? So without further ado, let's introduce you to ourselves and to our organization. So as your host today, I am the Chief Technology Officer at Synozur. Synozur is a transformation company. We're an advisory firm that works on transforming business and culture for our clients. And we focus on what those outcomes are. When you think about us, our name comes from the North Star. The ancient Greek term, Synozur, represents our commitment to help you find that navigational point that you can use to chart your journey wherever it needs to be. We focus our services on these four areas. We look at organizational transformation, at go-to-market change, at technology, and how do you reinvent the employee experience itself. So a little bit of background on me. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I spent most of the last 10 years as head of product marketing for content management at Microsoft, prior to a tenure that's taken me through several other Fortune 500 companies along the way and a few smaller places in addition. My master's degree is in corporate finance from Boston College on the East Coast, and it's great to be here with you today. And of course, it's great to be joined by my colleague, Matt. Matt, why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself to our audience?
Good morning from Colorado. Might get some thunderstorms today. I'm Matt. First career was Air Force. Second was software engineering. And then me and some other guys said, well, let's start a company doing this. So we started Salient 7. And then after running a software engineering company for a while, I went to run a commercial property management company, which had over 700 employees spread out over 5 states. And so it was at that point where I got the honor and experience to use a company operating system. So happy to be here today. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Matt. So as we get going, just a couple of house rules. Today's session is being recorded. So if you see a slide go by and you want to get to it later, we'll have that recording up available to you both via email and on the Synozur website within the next 24 hours. And if you're not familiar with this, today we're using Teams webinar. So if you have a question, we'll have Q&A at the end, but please feel free to use the Q&A function in the bar at the top of your screen to pose that. We have my colleague Michelle joining us this morning, who's going to help us monitor the Q&A. We love to take questions as we go, but of course, if you'd rather wait until the end, that's fine as well. So we're at the beginning of the class, so of course, why not start with a quiz? And so the first survey I want to launch here should be coming up here on Teams momentarily. And so the question is, are your company's purpose, vision, mission, and values, are they not published at all? Are they on the front office wall alone? Or are they integrated as part of your business process and culture? Take a minute, put them through. We're watching the responses come in. Give it another couple of seconds. And so not that there's a winner in this, but absolutely what we see is, so far everyone is responding. They're hanging on the front office only. That means that they're there, they're written down, but they may be observed in passing, but that they're not integrated into how you go about your day-to-day and your year-to-year business. So fairly common to see that pattern out there, I would say. Wouldn't you, Matt?
Yes, I think that's the norm.
Yep. So Matt, why don't you take us through a little bit of the business case for why strategy ultimately matters and why so much of the data shows us that it's difficult for organizations.
You bet. Vistage is a wonderful global company that puts CEO peer groups together, and at least once a year, they do a survey of what's going on in the CEO world. So just 2 years ago, 35% of CEOs in Vistage in the survey said that our resources are well aligned to priorities. And two key words there, resources, priorities. Only 50% regularly measure progress and goals. And here's the kicker, is only 17% have an established framework, right? I love the term framework because think it's process light. It's process with freedom. But what we get from this is CEOs themselves, not managers, not staff, saying, hey, only about 1 in 10 actually have some sort of framework they use to manage the company, the goals, and the strategic choices that they're making. Didn't Synozur do a little research, Chris?
Yeah, we did. So we conducted a survey with about 150 different organizations asking, what identify of these areas, your long-term action plans, major company initiatives, the choices you make to win, or living your mission statement. What is your business strategy? And what we found was less than half could identify that business strategy is about making choices to put you in position to win. So I thought that was fascinating that that's where so many organizations are coming up. I do think, Matt, that there's a tendency for strategic to mean the things that I think are important that I want to underline so other people think my activities matter. What have you seen about, why is it hard to put these frameworks in place around an organization?
Well, I'd say it's less popular than it is hard. It's really not that difficult to put in a management framework that we call a company operating system is really a straightforward, simple thing that's not that complex. What it takes is intentionality and discipline. Not a ton of it. It's just a new muscle that leaders and organizations need to develop, I find that a lot of organizations have goals set. They'd like to know what they want their revenue or whatever their biggest success measure is if they're a nonprofit to be. But we've also find that there's a lot of chaos. And what is chaos? Chaos is a lack of order. It's a lack of intentionality. Chaos is ad hoc. So it's not that difficult to do. People don't do it. Organizations don't do it because it's so hard. They do it just for lacking the intentionality, or maybe just they don't know what they don't know about the value of implementing a simple management framework.
I'd love you to comment on this, Matt. What's fascinating to me is if you look at those numbers that you put up from Vistage before, that people don't align resources, they don't measure what they're doing, they don't have a framework. Why is anyone still making money?
I'd say that's the difference between good and great, right? And intentionality is the solution to close the delta between good and great. The typical small business journey is you have an engineer or a founder, somebody that's great at a craft, and they have the opportunity to scale that business. And they find more people to help them deliver it. Then you need people to help administrate it. You need people to help sell it. And you kind of hit that ceiling or the base of what we might call an impact zone, where there's an opportunity to get more intentional about scaling, an opportunity to get more people, the entire organization on board with what do we do, how do we win, and how do we measure if how we win is working the way we expect it to.
Well, thanks for taking us through that. So one of the things that you mentioned before that you've used yourself is the company operating system, both for our own clients and in the organizations that you've helmed before. So I think it's time for you to take us a little bit through what is the company operating system?
You bet. Company operating system, if you have gray hair like I do, back when we were in management school in college, we called it a management framework. It's also known as a business operating system or a company operating system today. And a company operating system is very intentional, just like the operating system on your computer or your phone is intentional. It creates clarity and focus. It creates that clarity and focus on what are our priorities, right? This is a way of getting rid of the chaos. And after creating it, you maintain that focus on that priorities, and your measure, is it working? Is our plan working? Are our priorities giving us the outcomes that we expected? And it maintains that awareness. The intentionality and discipline of looking at those measures on a very intentional basis will let you know, is our plan working or not? So the real purpose of it, the why to do it, is better business and organizational performance. And you get that through alignment of your priorities, people, resources, and plans, and looking at, is it working?
So, Matt, if an organization is not intentional, what does that look like for them?
Anxiety, a
Okay.
lack of clarity. Am I doing the right thing? What is my responsibility? Does what I'm doing in my role matter? How does what I'm doing roll up to where we're going as a team? A unhealthy competitiveness perhaps between team members because they're not moving towards a shared common goal, and we're not looking at success the right way. So there's a lot of interpersonal friction, organizational friction, lack of effectiveness that we see when there's the chaos of not having a framework of managing our company with a company operating system.
So, why don't you take us through kind of what it looks like when you have one?
Sure, we mentioned that clarity focus is right at the core, which the outcome will be that improved business performance. Now, a company operating system isn't about purely shining a light on who's responsible for what and holding them accountable, but that's somewhat of a side benefit you get, is there's clarity on what are people accountable for, where are we going together, and are things getting done? The things that are getting done, are they working the way we expected them to? So when you're measuring, you get that honest measurement, right? You can't kid yourself about, hey, the company's doing great, my department's doing great, or it feels like we're successful out in the marketplace, right? Sure, a P&L report are numbers, but when you look at some of the activities you're doing and the strategic positioning, when you're this intentional and disciplined about looking and measuring your activities and those outcomes, you can't kid yourself about it. So as you're doing that throughout the year, you have at least a quarterly opportunity, if not monthly, to pivot with agility on our plans, our tactics, and maybe even strategy for a longer term if you're not getting the outcome as expected.
Yeah, I would observe, Matt, that I've seen on some of the boards of directors I serve on, even at board level, there tends to be a focus on details of tactics. What was revenue last month? How many new customers have we taken in? And granted, those might be elements that point you to evaluating how you're doing strategically. But I think that what you're getting into is in many ways about taking what that idealized board of directors could be doing and taking that strategic focus and extending it with intentionality. Let's use your word throughout the organization. That's great. You have done this, I know, with some organizations even more recently. I wonder if you could take a minute and take us through what success looks like with the company OS.
You bet. Let's talk about this one luxury brand that Synozur helped. It was a very established company, about 20 years old. The founders were still running it. They manufacture their own very, very high-end luxury products. I mean, very high-end, right? And they were successful to start with. They'd been very successful over the last 4 or 5 years. But they had found some of the ceilings that they wanted to get through as the founders running the company. So we came in and we did some discovery with them and realized that a company operating system would really benefit them. So we got them on a annual plan. We helped them put that annual plan together. We helped them create their targets. We got them in a weekly meeting rhythm, which is really probably the magic of this whole company operating system process for keeping everything on track and getting the value you expect out of that. And we're just in the process of designing a new C-level team, a new org structure, right? So as they were bringing in new executives into this well-established company, the company operating system really helped everybody get on the same page about where are we going and how are we going to get there and how do we measure it to make sure that we're getting the outcomes we want. And they are very disciplined and reaping the success of their company OS today. You bet. there are four key components or major areas of a company operating system. The first one is your business foundations. And a lot of people are very familiar with the items that are in your business foundation. So on our next slide here, you're going to see it's our purpose, our vision, our mission, our targets. And at the core of that are our company core values, our organization core values, right? Chris, we go to that next slide there. Here's our core values at the beginning. Now, part of the company OS journey is about establishing a common taxonomy, right? What do words mean? So to some people, some organizations, based on their history and their education, their experience, purpose might mean something a little different than vision. People might have different definitions of vision or mission or targets, right? For us, we consider the purpose is the why we exist, the why we get out of bed in the morning, why we want to, how we're going to make the world a better place, what motivates us, right? Vision is what we want to become. Mission is the what we do. And of course, targets are metrics that we want to get to. And core values, everybody's pretty much heard of. But where we like to help companies is take core values from either being conversational and undocumented to on the wall in the office front lobby is a very common one that we learned earlier, to actually integrating the core values in company processes around people, around collaboration and communication. So most people are familiar with those terms. So when we look at the second component, which is strategy, strategy is often very misunderstood, and people have very different definitions or perceptions of what they think strategy is. So here we've got a few examples, 4 examples of how strategy can often be misunderstood. It can be confused with goals. For instance, our strategy is to grow market share by 10%. Well, that's not really a strategy. That's a target. It's not a strategy within itself. It's somewhere you want to end up if your strategy is working the way you want to. Vision or mission statements. Our strategy is to be the industry leader in sustainability. Well, again, that is an outcome and where you want to end up and what you achieve, but it's not how you're going to get from here to there. Operational effectiveness is extremely important in an organization. You have to do things well. You have to keep the engine running. You have to keep improving the engine for operational effectiveness. So if an organization was to say, our strategy is to be as efficient as possible with our internal operations, again, not a strategy because it's internal focused and it's not customer choice focused. Tactics or activities. Our strategy is aggressive marketing. Well, aggressive marketing could be a necessary piece, but insufficient of getting where you want to go. And it might support customers choosing you and making that choice in the marketplace. But again, tactics are actions that are taken. It's not a complete set of choices about how to win in the marketplace.
Now, Matt, one of the things that we spoke to, wait for this to come up. So we spoke to Dr. John Hillen, who is a best-selling author. He's a tenured professor at a number of schools about strategy. And he had some interesting stories that he shared for us in the Polaris podcast at polaris@synozur.com about how strategy comes up in the course of the year. And what he was saying was primarily he gets a lot of calls from folks every year around September and says, hey, it's time to do strategy. And his response to them is usually, it's fascinating that you have tamed all of the forces of the outside world to the level where you can decide that you will look at strategy when it suits you. And his clients and prospects come to him and like, are you trying to talk yourself out of a job? And he says, absolutely. If this is done right, strategy is something that you're doing not once a year, but it's happening every quarter, every month, every day. And so what you're doing offsite is a thinly disguised budget exercise, he likes to say. So let's get back to, sorry, there's a little bit of lag coming through on Teams. So I am going to skip what John just said as a live video and ask you to talk a little bit more about what is strategy now that we've talked about what it's not.
You bet. I love Roger Martin's definition, which it's an integrated set of choices that puts you on the playing field you want to be on, so the way that you'll win, or so that the way that customers will choose you. And that strategy, that set of choices that work together, have to result in a competitive or a sustainable competitive advantage, right? Strategy includes making a theory. You're kind of creating a bit of a crystal ball and taking a stance and an opinion of what's going to happen in the future with the market, with customer behavior, with some of the forces out there in the marketplace. And after you create that theory, you need to make a bet about we're going to position ourselves here in order to meet that market need for these customers at this timing. And we're going to make this bet to believe that customers will choose us over the competition, which is competitive advantage, and that we will maintain that in a sustainable way.
So, time for our next quiz. So our quiz showing up in the chat. How often does your company take a disciplined approach to strategy and goal setting? While we're waiting for some of those answers to come through, I would observe that we at Synozur, are a relatively young organization, about 2 years, and we're on an annual cycle right now for making sure that we're looking at it at the top line. However, we are moving toward making sure that we are reevaluating our strategy, especially as it relates to the market and customers, on at least a quarterly basis. Matt, what are some of the things that you've seen from customers while we're waiting for more responses to come through?
You bet. We asked this question very intentionally here about strategy and goal setting, right? And your strategy really shouldn't be something that changes every quarter. If so, you're probably not intentional enough about looking in your crystal ball and looking forward. Now, you should be retrospective and say, is our strategy working? Are we getting the outcomes we expect, or the steps towards those outcomes every quarter? So with strategy, it's set and it should be there for quite a while. Think a year or two plus. And if the market forces change, then you change it. When it comes to planning, what are we going to do in order to make our strategy choices happen? That should be done at least annually, and you set your annual targets. And then part of the company operating system focus rhythm is meeting quarterly to set the quarterly rocks, which I believe we'll talk about soon in the future here.
Yep. So as we're seeing, a third of the audience has a never approach, and that's also fairly common. Many organizations, as Dr. Hillen would point out, are doing something once a year, but what that thing isn't strategy. And so he's spoken a lot about the importance of thinking strategically, which is a fascinating term to me. Matt, can you kind of walk us through, what are some of the elements about thinking strategically?
You bet. And these are in no order. They're certainly not in order of importance, because this top one of think long term, look into the future, this is often a misnomer with strategic thinking, right? If I just think long term, if I think only about the future, I'm thinking strategically. No, you're thinking long term. It's necessary but insufficient. So to think strategically, you need to recognize patterns. Look in the marketplace, look at customer behavior, look at your own organization's journey, recognize patterns that happen when there are changes in the forces in the marketplace. If you're thinking strategically, it's all about the customer, because the strategy is, why will the customer choose us? Why will they choose us over the competition, right? What are the forces out there that cause customers to make a choice? You must be obsessed about those choices, not just customer satisfaction, which I think, especially in the services industry, we think about being customer obsessed as, is a customer happy? Back up into that customer journey and be obsessive about why are they making the choices they are, even before we deliver a service or a product to them. So forecast the future. There's that crystal ball we were talking about, right? A point of caution is data is very informative and insightful for looking at past behavior, but data is not forward looking. So don't be allured by looking at data to say that the future will be like the past. It can be an indicator, but not necessarily a foundational law, so to speak. Ask great questions, right, to formulate your strategy. Think about design thinking, implement that if you can. I love the question of what would happen if, right, an open-ended, possibility-focused question. What would happen if we did X, Y, and Z as a strategy? If we chose those options, those set of integrated choices, would our customer choose us? And if we think that's a good option, the second question to use to explore is what would need to be true in order for those things to be in place, right? So strategies first, have that theory about where we're going to play and where we're going to win. What choices are we going to make so the customer chooses us? Then you can move on to the internal focus part, which is planning.
Great.
So let's talk about strategy versus planning. There are some stark differences. And the reason why we're very intentional about talking about strategy versus planning is that I've found 8, 9 people, business owners, even C-levels, 8, 9 out of 10 really confuse planning with strategy. So let's show some differences here. When you're talking about strategy, the focus is external. It's on your customers, right? About the choices we're going to make so that the customer will choose us. The focus for planning is very much internal. What are we going to do? We're going to increase this capability. We're going to set up this capability. We're going to change this management system. We're going to hire more people. We're going to go into a new geography. Your customer doesn't care about those internal plans, right? And you expect those internal plans to actually influence that customer's choice. So control for strategy, your customers are in control. You are not in control of strategy. You're in control of the choices, but those outcomes are all about the customer. Are they choosing us? When it comes to planning, you're managing your internal resources. You're entirely in control there. That results in strategy planning and doing strategy can be a uncomfortable place because you're out of control. Planning is very comfortable because it's within your control. You're controlling those internal resources and making plans about those. Purpose of strategy is about an outcome. Purpose of planning is about activities, about getting things done. And the risks in strategy are high. In planning, they are much lower. So again, the difference between strategy and planning is strategy is the outcomes of customer choices, and planning is really output about things that are in our control internally. Okay, that was a lot about strategy, but because of the common misunderstandings, we wanted to camp there a little bit. Let's talk about an annual plan. Annual objectives or priorities, these are really things that we're going to focus on as an organization. Think 3 to 5 most important things that are really going to move the needle for where our company is or where our organization is, right? This could look like new capabilities or new market position. This is very different than the annual targets, right? For a business, usually the top 3 or 4 look like what's our annual revenue, what's our bottom line profit, what's our customer sat number. Those are actual targets, which are much different than objectives or priorities. Priorities and objectives are about outcomes. Targets are about measures. So in the annual plan, when you've defined those top level objectives and priorities, things we really want to move the needle on this year in the business, then every quarter you define the rocks, right? Rocks comes from the illustration of that college professor that put the big rocks in the jar first because they were the most important things to put in there. And then you can use the smaller rocks and the sand and the water to fill in the holes there. So every quarter, when you identify which rocks need to get done that quarter in order to support an annual objective or priority, this is what brings that clarity. It brings focus. It maintains that focus, and it creates accountability because only one person can be responsible for ensuring that a rock gets done. They might not be the person doing it, but they're the person that ensures that it gets done. And how you get to the annual plan is obviously through a workshop, right? To identify your annual objectives, your targets, and your rocks. So that is the third component.
Yeah, within that, obviously, there's more than just saying do a workshop. It takes discipline and intention to make sure that it doesn't turn into what I love to call BOP set, bunch of people sitting around talking. and then let's write things on a whiteboard and take a screenshot of it and paste it into a PowerPoint deck, and we've done our plan.
Yeah, annual planning is not a half-day process, for even a small business of think 10 or 20 people, or a larger business that has an executive team of, 6 or 7 people as department VPs or heads. This should be kind of a 2 or 3 day exercise, because you're going to revisit that strategy. You're going to look back on last year and do a retrospective. You're going to redefine those targets. There's going to be a lot of discussion and collaboration and input that goes into creating that annual plan. It is much more involved and in-depth and more collaborative than just the boss saying, here's our targets for the year. How are you guys going to do that?
Right.
So our fourth and last component is a focus rhythm, which is really the collection of things that keep us in a rhythm, on track of maintaining that focus on our priorities, right? You need a scorecard, because what gets measured gets managed, right? Early in my career, I heard this great saying, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. For your scorecard, this is very true. And the scorecard is different than targets. Targets are measuring, the outcome of our activities. A scorecard usually is measuring, are we doing the activities? Are we doing them? How often? I think marketing has some great scorecard items in there of how many social media posts are we doing? How many likes are we getting, right? How many reposts and shares? These might be lower level, more tactical things that are we doing the activities, and are the activities working? And this would work obviously in conjunction with your high level annual and quarterly targets. Annual planning, we talked about how to do that. Quarterly planning should be done every quarter, looking retrospective, and this is at least a day-long activity for a team to do quarterly planning. But the real magic of a company operating system, the discipline and what makes it happen and makes your outcomes really happen, is a weekly focus meeting. This is a very intentional agenda where you're reading through the rocks and who's accountable for them, and the person must report if it's on track, off track, or off track, and I want to talk about it in the last half of the meeting. You look at the scorecard, you review the to-dos, just to keep them on top of everybody's radar. And then in this 1 hour meeting, the last half is problem solving or issue processing, right? And when I was running a company that had hundreds of people in it, our issues list we used for problem solving the last part of the meeting, well, we usually had between 70 and 100 items on there, and anybody could put an item on there any time of the week. But during this last 30 minutes in the meeting, you kind of do what I call arm wrestling. You pick 3 topics at a time that you want to talk about. So if somebody really needs to process an issue, whoever kind of shouts the loudest, you get to talk about it first. So you might get through 1 issue in that week. You might get through 5 issues, depending on what the week looks like. But just the walking through of this agenda every week, getting those rocks reviewed, if they're on track, off track, and reading the to-dos out loud. This is where the magic happens, and anybody can lead this meeting. To lead this meeting isn't a place of authority and decision making. It's simply walking through the same agenda, so you could have someone different actually lead the team through this agenda, this meeting every week. So we looked at the 4 components of our operating system, and I think next we're going to talk about how to actually get things going.
Yeah, Matt, so one of the things that I think comes up in many organizations is you have strategic excellence and you have operational excellence. Could you talk a little bit about where you draw the distinction between strategy versus operations?
You bet. There's a little bit of a little synonymous with strategy versus planning, right? Strategy is very forward-looking. Strategy is very much about outcome focus and about where we're going, and is the customer choosing us. Operational efficiency is very inward-looking. It's improving our engine, whether that's manufacturing widgets, writing computer code, or selling real estate. How do we do that better? How do we improve the engine? How do we make business as usual being business that's better? So there's kind of a very distinctive line between the strategic and the operational.
One thing I think that happens in many organizations, and I've certainly experienced this personally, is whatever your annual cycle is, you come out of it with the best of intentions. And when you start to put that into practice, the discipline of having a monthly meeting or a weekly focus rhythm meeting sometimes can fall apart. Why do you see focus rhythm fails in many organizations?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Oftentimes that meeting gets hijacked, right, with other topics, with other priorities. And when I've worked with teams and companies, and the bigger the company, the bigger the opportunity to have this problem is that the focus meeting will get repurposed for other things, right? So the focus meeting, really the agenda should never be changed, right? It may be tweaked to make it bespoke for a team, but this is not where, oh, it's a time during the week when we get our team together every week. So we have a big event coming up. So we're going to use half this meeting for planning for our big event that's going to happen in our company or our market. Don't change the agenda. Keep the focus meeting what it is and keep its agenda. If you need a different meeting, have a different meeting. Another way where I've seen it go sideways is instead of staying focused on the where we're going and is our strategy and our plan working, it becomes a historical backwards looking inventory of things I did this week or this month, right? To kind of use as a justification of I'm doing what I said I would do. Well, that's not the intention of this. The accountability is good. Remember, that's a byproduct of a company operating system, but it's not the purpose. So keeping it from a, hey, look what I did meeting and keeping it focused on the where we're going and what are we going to do together is key.
One of the things just hearing you walk through that, Matt, and you and I have presented this material several times before, but when you were describing the issue list, I was recalling a manager I worked with at State Street back in Boston who was very disciplined about issue lists. And one of the things I've observed is issue lists can accidentally turn into this catch basin of complaints and risks and other things. And this manager had the discipline that came from IT service management principles and ITIL about an issue is something that requires a decision. So merely putting down costs, costs could grow doesn't actually do anything. It needs to be something that we can discuss and make a decision about. Otherwise, it's not a practical issue. And so I think that's another one of those tools that you can use to make sure that those focus meetings are interacting and doing the right things as opposed to getting bogged down in narrative and storytelling.
Sure. And two things I think of when you tell that story is, don't come with just a complaint, come with a solution, which leads me into a part of design thinking of turn it into a question. What would happen if we, right? Or if we don't, or we're seeing this happen, this might be a landmine or a pothole in the road down the road. How can we get around that, right? So turn it into a question.
Sure. Well, last act here before we open this up for Q&A is just talking through not just the business case, not just what goes into it, but how do you establish a first time or a revamped company operating system?
Great question. Educating people of what is it? What is a company OS? Why are we doing this, right? Will help create that awareness of the purpose of it and, WIFM principle, what's in it for me? And that will help obtain people's buy-in and wanting to be part of this, understanding the outcome of it. And it's not just the flavor of a month of another thing and process that we're going to try that's coming down from management, right? So there are a number of frameworks out there that you can kind of pick up off the shelf or you can create your own. Again, this isn't a highly complex thing, it's highly intentional, but tailor it to what fits for your organization. Either create it bespoke, or you could take one like EOS or scaling up off the shelf, but tweak it if you need to, right? Make it work for your organization's needs. And the format is really pales in comparison in importance to actually just doing it. So whether you do it on paper, a PDF, I did it for a couple of years on a Word document early on, right? No fancy software. Do what works for you. Just do it is what's really key. And there are a number of digital options out there. So what format you choose isn't important. Just choose something, roll with it, get in the rhythm of it.
Yeah. You know, Matt, one of the things that we do at Synozur is we like to bring maturity models to bear. And if you're not familiar with maturity model, ours usually take the CMMI 5 approach, which there are 5 levels of maturity, and you look across multiple disciplines. And so this is a higher level way of thinking about this. But if you look, for example, at business foundations, you know, on the left, you know, are they undocumented, or all the way at the end, alignment measured and reviewed on schedule? And so you can probably look at this and these different rows. There are other rows that we could add, but to be honest, think about how your organization works. You know, what's documented, or things existing, or are you using SMART goals? What does the leadership structure look like? And you kind of circle where you think all of those things are, and you can come in and do a more detailed evaluation. You come up with a weighted score. And typically you'll come in and say that you're a 210 or you're a 280. You know, I do think that there's a tendency when you're thinking about maturity models to want to push everything all the way over to the right and say, we want to be, fully mature and integrated in every one of these disciplines. Matt, what are some of the risks about trying to go all the way to the right too quickly?
Well, you can bite off too much too soon, right? And if everything's a priority, nothing is a priority. So, for instance, if we just look at the 2 rows of goals and strategy, if a company is performing okay, they're at that good stage, right? The goal setting might not be most important to them for that quarter or that half year or year, but strategy might be what's most important, right? Because they are really just ad hoc in what they're doing. They're very internal capability focused. So spending the organizational time and energy and effort to go look at what are our customers doing, what are they choosing, look into the future, create that theory about how will we get the customers to choose us and identify those choices could be more important than actually the goal setting, for instance. Now, I would never advocate not having goals, but it's just you got to stop and take inventory of where are we in our journey, what's going to be most valuable, because you just can't do it all at once. People will get lost, they'll get overwhelmed, and make sure you take off a bite-sized chunk at a time.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about thinking, though, about a maturity model, and it's one of the things that sort of led me during my tenure at Microsoft as a leader in marketing to think about how we approach quarterly and annual quote unquote planning. And at Microsoft, as part of the culture that at least once or twice a year, you go to a 2-day offsite, meaning you go to a different building on campus. You're not going to some exotic location. And for a couple of years, most of my team's offsites follow the same pattern as everyone else's. You go to somewhere, you go to a conference room, and you look at the major activities for the year, and then you ask everyone to do sort of a retrospective. You may do some sort of team building exercise. Day 2 in the morning, you go to a whiteboard, you start writing things down, and you turn it into a PowerPoint slide, and you take that PowerPoint slide, you bury it in SharePoint somewhere, because at the start of the next year's annual plan, you're going to use it and look at it again for the first time. And I knew there should be a better way to make sure that we were disciplining it. So, Matt, that's actually how you and I first started working together, because we engaged you to come in to bring this company operating system approach into Microsoft, to be able for us to think strategically about what was going to be happening out there. Where did we want to place bets? Did we want to place bets on customer development or field development or channel development? And it was a much stronger framework that allowed us to sort of bring that discipline forward throughout the year. And I remember, Matt, you and I had a number of discussions kind of leading into that first 2 day, and it did not all happen during those 2 days. It took us, several months forward to get this instantiated. What are some of the things that when people are on their journey, what are some of the questions they should be asking themselves?
What do we call things is one of my favorite, the taxonomy, right? Vision, mission, value. What value is pretty clear. purpose, when you think about metrics, identifying those metrics and defining, not identifying the metrics only, but defining how do we measure this is super important, right? Which framework are we going to sign up to? I know Microsoft was a fan of using OKRs, objectives and key results, right? Which ironically Google made popular. They didn't invent it, made popular years before. It's been around quite a while. But you have to subscribe to a framework. Which one is going to work best for the team or the organization? And, we don't always have organizations, clients call us up in November, December, say, hey, I want to get started in January. We might get the call in March, right? Where they've got to start midway through the year. So of course you can start midway through the year. You come up with we'll call it an annual plan, but it's for the last 6 months of that year. Who is on the team where you're using an operating system is a very intentional choice, right? If you've got a small business of 10 people and one founder, that founder may have one person that they bring into the business operations, one person on the management team, so to speak. So it might just be those 2 people doing it. If you're in an enterprise and you're on a team that's a department, it could be the leaders of that team. Or if you're somewhere in the middle, it could be all the members of the team. You have to pay close attention and give some intentional thought of what is our organizational structure and what is the right visibility on our annual priorities. That should be everybody. Our quarterly rocks may be a smaller subset of people. And then you want to translate that down to a purpose level of how others are looking at it. So how do you get going? What do you do? It's in very intentional workshops that we have to help business owners, team leaders find their business foundations, or usually to articulate them and get them documented, because it's in their head. It might be in their culture, because everybody has a culture. They've just not been intentionally documented. So we have workshops we could do both remotely and in person to get through business foundations and strategy. Strategy is probably the longest one and the most difficult. It requires the most collaboration and great question asking. And annual planning is a workshop as well that we were talking about, and the focus rhythm. Quarterly planning is usually that one day we talked about, and weekly focus meeting is where the magic happens. Get that done every week. Don't change the agenda. So here, what we see is just a simple example of a one-pager that can help facilitate your company operating system. Remember, I said it's simple. You just got to be intentional about it. So your annual plan is here on the left. It has your priorities, has your targets, and then has your rocks here. Conditions of satisfaction is a term that I learned early in one of my companies, and we had some consultants from Australia, we go figure, come in and walk us through a management framework, and they use conditions of satisfaction. So instead of just saying what the rock is and having people have different perceptions about what success looks like for that, put the condition of satisfaction in there for that rock. For the business foundation, just document it, right? So here you see those 5 components of business foundations we talked about: your purpose, vision, mission, our core values. And for this one organization that this template came from, it had enduring principles as well, right? It's a little bit of a longer story about aspects of our culture that will always live around, that work in conjunction with the values, but they're a little bit longer story. And then your target market, and of course those targets there. So this is just an example of how simple it can be to use a paper format for starting and managing your company operating system.
And another technique, if you want to move to something a little bit more sophisticated, but not a lot, remembering there's a maturity journey. This is an example. Power BI has a feature called metrics that is something you can use without any programming skill whatsoever. And so it allows you to define that hierarchy of the things that we want to track, and have a technical framework that allows individual owners to step in and update the values and add comments so that you have a consistent place to look, along with a history. And of course, over time, you can wire these things to pull their data directly from line of business sources. And this is another click stop on the journey. There are many more sophisticated systems that are out there for objective management and strategy management, but these are just a couple. Matt, what are some of the things that you see are the leading practices that help organizations be successful?
We mentioned before, educate folks on the why are we doing this? What is it? How does it fit into your role? How does it fit into daily work? What part of this is strategic? Which part is operational effectiveness? Educating on the difference between strategy and planning and how this works with our initiatives or our projects that we have in the company. So you really, really have to educate people to get that buy-in. Choose a framework, choose your own, choose one that's off the shelf. Again, that taxonomy so that everybody has the same understanding of what our terms mean is huge. And it's always a great job to hire a consultant to get you going. I have a small business here locally to where I'm at that I implemented a company OS with them. And I was out of the country for a few weeks and they needed to do their quarterly offsite. And I had already done a few with them. They did it themselves. And when I got back, I checked in with them and they said, wow, it is really valuable just to have a third party facilitate quarterly planning because you don't have that bias of being inside the organization, inside the team, living it out every day. So hire a consultant for expertise to facilitate. Always have an outside person facilitate your planning so that they have that third eye perspective. And, be honest, data does not lie. Like in a relationship, I've heard when you get a couple of partners that live together, married, talking about a budget and how they're going to manage their money, you create a budget and you make the budget the bad guy, right? Not the other person in the relationship. So data is kind of the same way. Use data to be the bad guy when you're looking at things working or are they not working.
I think that's great. So Matt, I'm going to ask you to come here on camera with us, camera as well, as we're wrapping this up. What are some of the things that you find specifically organizations should think about as they're picking frameworks?
Yeah, I think you need to look at what complexity does your organization and your team members and your leaders, what's their appetite for complexity, right? There are some off the shelf such as EOS, Entrepreneur's Operating System, that's based on the book Traction by Gino Wickman. It's super popular, probably the most popular one. You can get that book Traction, read it, and you can download the tools in EOS for free off of the web. They don't even charge for those. You can hire a consultant that's EOS certified. There's another framework out there called Scaling Up. It used to be called Gazelles years ago that Vernon Harnish stood up. There's OKRs, Objectives Key Results, that we mentioned that Google made very famous. That's mostly goal and measurement oriented, not as much emphasis on strategy with that. With the tools you can use for that, again, paper, Word documents. Viva Goals was a pretty effective tool that Microsoft had going for a while. Chris showed us how we could use Power BI to do some great goal tracking that has it innately in Power BI. And there are a couple other software tools out there you can use. And of course, Excel is always the database of choice to track things, right?
Yeah, I have found that many organizations sort of get it backwards. They think they need to bring in a management framework, and so it becomes a software selection project. And with the usual assumption that if we go by Viva Goals, Power BI, Profit.co, choose your flavor, we will have a framework. And I think that that's something that is, as we've walked through it today, that's a late binding decision for how you think about a company OS. So we're just approaching the end of time here. So at least the time for today's masterclass. So I wanted to just take a moment here and share a few resources. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, we will be presenting and sponsoring and speaking about company operating systems and a plethora of topics at TechCon 365 Seattle, starting next Monday, June 23rd. You can follow this link to get to more detail. There's plenty of information available at our website at Synozur.com, including details about company operating systems, what we're doing with AI, some of the services that we're bringing from partners, and we're usually quite active on social media as well. So I'd just like to take a minute. If you have a question you'd like to post in the chat, I will optimize for that. And so, let me just ask you to sort of recap not just what are the steps you use to get started, but what happens first if you want to implement a company operating system? There's a couple of things we could do, but what are the first one or two things you need to do?
That's a question for me.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Get with your team, right? When you determine who is going to be the management team that's meeting every week, that's doing annual planning, that's doing quarterly planning, get with them and talk about the need, right? And what you expect to get out of it and why we're doing this to get that buy-in. And then reach out to an expert, right? Get that consultant, call Synozur, but call somebody to help you get going and help you select the right framework.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to watch the Q&A one more second. We are approaching time, and I want to be respectful of our audience as well as your time, Matt. So on behalf of Synozur, thank you very much for joining us. This broadcast will be published within the next 24 hours through our website and over email. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Chris.